My boat was already in the water, the engine running softly as the early morning mist floated over the surface of my private lake. I was about to cast off when I heard tires screeching on gravel. I turned, and there she was, HOA Debbie, storming down the embankment in her neon blazer and high heels, holding a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. "You are in violation," she barked, marching toward my dock like she owned it. "This dock doesn't meet HOA regulation standards, and your boat access is hereby suspended until reviewed." I almost laughed, thinking it was a prank. My ranch wasn't part of the HOA. Not by a long shot. I bought this 200-acre ranch 5 years ago exactly because I wanted peace, privacy, and no nosy neighbors dictating what color my fence should be or how long my grass could grow. But Debbie didn't care about borders or rules unless they worked in her favor. I told her kindly, at first, "Ma'am, this dock is on my land, and this lake is entirely within my property lines. You've got no say here." She stepped closer, her face twisted with fury. "The HOA board has agreed that this lake affects our ecosystem, and your activities could be damaging to our water quality. I will be filing a cease and desist." Then came the line that really made my blood boil. "If you don't stop using this lake immediately," she sneered, "we'll be shutting down your water access and your entry to the community fishing season." I froze. "My fishing season?" She stormed off, leaving tire tracks and threats in her wake. My hands trembled, not from fear, but fury, because what she didn't know was that the entire HOA community, dozens of members, used a small stretch of my land for seasonal fishing, thanks to an agreement my grandpa made decades ago. And I had never revoked it. Until now. I reached for my phone, took a deep breath, and said aloud to myself, if they want war, they just got it. But before we get to that moment, let me tell you how this madness all began. My name's Jake Carter. I'm a retired firefighter who decided to invest my life savings into this peaceful ranch on the edge of a small town in Tennessee. My granddad left me the blueprints to the place, along with a simple note, "Freedom lies where the lake meets the pines." I didn't fully understand it until I moved in. The lake was my sanctuary. I'd spend early mornings out there on my boat, fishing in peace or just drifting while reading old adventure novels. Sometimes my dog Rusty, a golden retriever with more energy than sense, would leap in and chase frogs along the shore. I wasn't always a loner, though I welcomed visitors. The HOA folks, mostly from a nearby upscale housing development, would occasionally wave when hiking near the boundary. A few even came over to fish during the official season. No one ever asked for permission, but I didn't mind. As long as they were polite and didn't litter, I believed in sharing what you have. But the problems began last spring when Debbie Jacobs was elected HOA president. You know the type, drives a silver Mercedes, walks her dog with a matching sweater, and treats every interaction like a courtroom battle. The first time I met her, she smiled so hard it looked painful and said, "Oh, you're the ranch guy. We'll have to get you on board with our community standards soon." I didn't think much of it until letters started coming. First, it was a friendly request to clear a few pine trees on my property that were obstructing the community view. Then it was a suggestion that I install uniform fencing for aesthetic unity. I ignored them. I didn't even live within HOA boundaries. This ranch was independently zoned. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. That's when the knocks began. Debbie showed up 3 times that summer, clipboard in hand, rules printed out in color, talking about environmental responsibility and community visual harmony. I explained over and over again, I'm not in your HOA. But that didn't stop her. Then came the fall fishing season. Traditionally, it started in late October and ran through November. The HOA families would set up their gear on the northern edge of my lake. Some brought kids, some brought wine. I watched from a distance, usually just happy to see people enjoying nature. But this time, Debbie set up folding tables, banners that read Annual HOA Lake Fishing Gala, and even porta potties. She gave speeches with a megaphone, acting like she owned the water. I could have stopped it then, but I didn't. I let them fish. I let them party. Until this morning. Now, standing on my dock, Debbie had crossed the line. Trying to ban me from using my own lake, threatening to revoke my boat access. My patience snapped like a twig in winter. So, I made some calls. First to my lawyer, then to a welding friend who owed me a favor. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Jake Carter Ranch, no trespassing signs were planted across the old trail paths. My friend arrived with a heavy-duty welding machine and steel gate panels. We welded shut the community access point that led into the fishing zone, the one they'd been using freely for decades. It up tight. The next morning, I printed 50 notices and hand-delivered them to the HOA's clubhouse. Effective immediately, access to Carter Lake for all non-residents is suspended. This includes fishing, docking, and recreational use. All agreements, verbal or implied, are hereby revoked. You'd think that would be the end of it. But the following week, I got a knock at my gate. It wasn't a neighbor. It was Debbie, with a sheriff's deputy standing beside her. And she had documents. What she said next made my jaw drop and nearly changed everything. Debbie stood at the gate like she was ready to win a courtroom trial. She clutched a manila folder thick with papers, while the sheriff's deputy beside her rested his hand casually on his belt. Rusty growled low from behind me, sensing something was off. I opened the gate part away but didn't unlatch the chain. "Morning," I said cautiously. "Mr. Carter," the deputy nodded. "We are here to talk about an alleged restriction to public water access." Debbie stepped forward like she'd been waiting all year to say those words. "You are unlawfully denying access to a shared water resource," she snapped. "The HOA has documents that prove we have rights to seasonal fishing on your lake, dating back decades." She waved the manila folder like it was a golden ticket. I blinked. "You're saying the lake I own is public now? It's about community trust and historical use." Debbie barked. "You may have the land, but the HOA has been using that section of the lake for generations. That makes it shared under implied easement laws. And if you don't remove your fences, we're prepared to escalate this to court." Now, I'm no lawyer, but I'm not stupid either. I calmly asked the deputy, "Am I being accused of a crime?" He shook his head. "No, sir. I'm just here to keep the peace." Debbie jumped back in. "We don't want trouble. We just want to continue our fishing season. Same as always." I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at her. This was the same woman who stood on my dock and told me I wasn't allowed to use my own boat. And now she was begging to keep her community party alive? Not after everything. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Let me make this crystal clear. This land, this lake, is not under your HOA's jurisdiction. If you want access, go to court. But until a judge tells me otherwise, those gates stay locked." Debbie's face went pale, then red. She snapped, "You'll regret this." But she stormed off anyway, dragging her folder of printed screenshots and old photos behind her. The deputy stayed a moment longer, offering a shrug. "Just letting you know, if it does go to court, it's going to be a circus. That's all I'll say." Then he tipped his hat and left. And just like that, the battle had begun. What Debbie didn't know, because she never cared to ask, was that my grandfather had kept records of every agreement made about that lake, and they were all handwritten, personal, temporary, and most importantly, expired. I spent the next few days digging through old files in my barn office. Rusty curled up next to the space heater. As I flipped through yellowed envelopes, brittle contracts, and scanned maps drawn with ink pens, I found what I needed. Papers signed by my grandfather and an old HOA president. The agreement was for a 10-year access window, which ended in 1999. They had nothing. Still, that didn't stop the HOA members from protesting. By Friday, a small crowd had gathered at the old access point, now blocked by my brand new metal gate and warning signs. Some brought fishing rods, acting confused. Others stood with Debbie, who shouted through a megaphone about unfair land hoarding and lake rights. One guy even shouted, Come on, man. We've been fishing here since I was a kid. I kept my distance, watching from the porch with binoculars. The next day, they brought cameras. A local blogger came out, hoping to film some viral injustice or whatever drama they thought they could stir up. I let them stand there, take selfies, record TikToks, but I didn't move an inch. Then things escalated again. It was early Sunday morning when I woke to Rusty's barking. I rushed out to find tire tracks along the side trail inside my ranch. I followed them down to the lake, and that's when I saw it. Someone had cut the lock off the northern gate. The chain lay in the dirt like a broken snake. A few muddy footprints led straight to the water, where trash floated, soda bottles, food wrappers, and even a pair of flip-flops. Someone had snuck in overnight and held an unauthorized fishing party on my land. Now I wasn't just mad. I was done being polite. I drove straight to the sheriff's office with the photos, vandalism, trespassing, tampering with private property. I filed the reports. The deputy I'd spoken to earlier looked frustrated but nodded, saying, "If they did this, it's out of our hands now. Let the courts handle it." By the time I got home, I had already made my decision. If they wanted to break the rules, I'd play by them, but harder. I called my friend Marcus, a conservation officer I'd helped during a fire rescue 2 years back. I told him what happened, and he agreed to come down and do a full inspection of the lake access zones and possible wildlife concerns. See, there was a little-known clause in the county's environmental preservation rules. If a body of water is being threatened by misuse, the owner can petition for it to be temporarily classified as a protected habitat zone. Especially if there's evidence of pollution or human damage. And thanks to Debbie's late-night fishing rebellion, I had plenty of evidence. Marcus showed up with an inspection kit, camera, and a clipboard of his own. He took water samples, documented the trash, and even noted a few rare bird species nesting in a patch of reeds near the southern bank. He smiled as he said, "You know, with the right forms and a petition letter, we could shut down this whole lake for public use for the next year or two under habitat protection." I grinned. "Let's do it." It took 2 weeks. I filled out every form, submitted every photo, and wrote a 5-page summary of the damage and trespass activity. I even included an old map proving how far the HOA boundary was from my lake. Debbie had tried to use bureaucracy against me. Now I was using it against her. By the 3rd week of November, I got the official notice. Carter Lake has been classified as a provisional protected habitat zone. All non-residential recreational activity, including fishing, docking, and events, is hereby prohibited effective immediately. Enforcement measures will be in place. I framed it and hung it right on my gate. But I didn't stop there. With the help of a local wildlife group, I installed surveillance cameras, posted new signs, and brought in 2 part-time rangers who rotated weekend patrols. The message was clear: no more fishing season. Not now. Not ever. At least not while I'm alive. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. You'd think that would break their spirit. But Debbie had one more trick up her sleeve. A week later, I got a certified letter in the mail. It wasn't from her, but from the HOA's lawyer, and what it said. Let's just say it was something I never saw coming. The letter was stamped in bold red ink: legal notice, cease and desist, request for obstruction of community traditional access. I sat on the porch, holding the envelope while Rusty growled low at the unopened mail, like he knew it carried bad news. I slid the letter out and started reading. The HOA's lawyer claimed that by cutting off access to the lake, something they now referred to as a generational shared resource, I was violating an unspoken but well-documented tradition. They weren't suing me outright, but they demanded I reopen the gates, remove all signs, and reverse the lake's protected status or face potential legal action. I read it twice, then a 3rd time, and then I laughed. This wasn't about tradition or community. This was Debbie's pride on paper. But the part that chilled me came near the end of the letter. If this matter is not resolved amicably within 14 days, the HOA reserves the right to pursue further legal actions, including but not limited to petitioning for an injunction to reverse habitat classification and seeking restitution for damages to the HOA's annual fishing program. Restitution damages? They were treating my land like a public park that I'd vandalized. I needed help. Real help. So I called up my cousin Ellie, who's a land rights attorney over in Nashville. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, but when she heard the situation, she told me, "Jake, this is classic HOA overreach, and frankly, it's illegal." She drove down that same weekend with a thick briefcase and a fire in her eyes. "Let's end this." Ellie went through every page I had, the expired access agreement, the photos of the vandalism, the protected habitat declaration, the security footage of a few HOA members sneaking through the trees at night with tackle boxes. She even flagged footage showing Debbie herself near the lake gate with bolt cutters in her hand. "I don't just have a defense," Ellie said. "I have a counterattack." While Ellie filed motions and crafted responses, I focused on keeping the lake protected. I wasn't just fighting for my property anymore. I was fighting for peace, for freedom, and for every landowner who'd ever been bullied by an HOA. But of course, things weren't quiet on Debbie's end. That weekend, a group of HOA members set up a mock fishing camp on their side of the boundary. They pitched tents, put up banners that read "Fishing is a right," and even invited a local news station. I watched them from a hilltop, arms crossed. A news van pulled in. Reporters interviewed Debbie, who dramatically waved her arms and said things like, "He's cutting off children from nature, and this is an attack on tradition and community unity." She cried on camera. Actual tears. Ellie called it a desperate PR stunt, but I wasn't so sure. That night, I started getting calls from people in town, old friends, the hardware store guy, even the pastor from the local church. All of them asking what was going on. Some were angry. Others were just confused. I realized then, Debbie was trying to make me the villain. So I made a move she didn't expect. I invited everyone in the HOA to an open ranch Q&A the following Saturday. I set up a few chairs, got some drinks and snacks, and printed out a big aerial map of the ranch showing property lines. Ellie was there with copies of the expired agreement, the vandalism reports, and the protected habitat papers. Dozens of people came, and when I calmly explained what had happened, how Debbie trespassed, vandalized my property, and then tried to weaponize community sympathy, people's faces changed. One man stood up and said, "Wait, she cut your chain lock?" Another woman asked, "So we never had actual permission to use your lake?" I answered, honestly, not legally. I allowed it out of kindness, until it was abused. By the time the meeting ended, half the HOA members looked like they were rethinking everything. Debbie didn't show up, of course. But the very next day, something else happened that turned this whole feud upside down. I got a knock on my front door just after sunset. It was Jeremy, the vice president of the HOA. He was holding a plastic cooler in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. "Can I talk to you for a sec?" he asked nervously. I stepped out and shut the door behind me. Rusty growled from the window but stayed put. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jeremy said. "I just wanted to say I didn't agree with how Debbie handled any of this." I folded my arms, listening. He handed me the manila envelope. "These are HOA minutes from a few months ago. I thought you should see them." I opened it up, and there it was. Debbie had proposed annexing the lake as a community asset. She had told the board she was working on acquiring public lake access and had even drafted a fake heritage claim for the HOA records. "She never had permission from the board to approach you directly," Jeremy said. "She acted alone. That changed everything. If Debbie acted without HOA approval, their threats meant nothing. And if I could prove it, the cease and desist was dead in the water." I thanked Jeremy and handed him a cold soda from the cooler on the porch. "You didn't have to do this," I said. He gave me a sad smile. "Honestly, I liked fishing with my son here, but not like this. Not if it cost people their dignity." We shook hands. I watched him walk away, the plastic cooler swinging at his side. That night, I handed the minutes over to Ellie. She laughed. This just turned into a slam dunk. But while we were celebrating that small win, my security cameras picked up something disturbing. At 2:14 a.m., two hooded figures slipped through the woods behind the ranch and headed toward the lake. One carried a bag. The other had something shiny in his hand. They didn't come to fish. They came to sabotage something. The motion alert on my phone went off at 2:14 a.m., buzzing beside my bed. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe Rusty tripping the porch sensor. But when I opened the app and watched the black and white footage, my stomach dropped. Two figures, hooded and sneaky, crept along the back fence line of the ranch. One held a large duffel bag. The other carried something long and metallic, a crowbar, maybe. They moved fast but carefully, clearly familiar with the layout of the property. They weren't just trespassing. They were planning something. I slid out of bed and grabbed my flashlight and my old Remington rifle. Not to shoot, but to warn. Rusty was already pacing by the door, ears up and alert. I called the sheriff's office as I stepped into my boots and gave my name and location. "We're dispatching a unit," the woman on the other end said. Then I slipped out into the darkness. The air was sharp and cold, and the moon was full, lighting just enough of the land for me to navigate quickly. I moved quietly along the tree line, following the direction they were headed, straight for the lake. I could hear them before I saw them. "You sure this is the pump?" one whispered. "Yeah," the other said. "Mess it up real bad, enough to flood the trail, then say it was the rancher's fault." There was no doubt who she was. Debbie had crossed the line again. I waited until they knelt beside the pump station near the lake's edge, one pulling out a wrench from the bag, the other fumbling with bolts. Then I flipped on my flashlight and leveled my voice. "You have 10 seconds to drop everything and back away." They froze. The flashlight beam lit up their faces. Teenagers, maybe high school seniors. One of them looked like the kid I'd seen mowing Debbie's lawn last summer. The one with the wrench dropped it fast and held up his hands. "Please don't shoot." "I'm not going to shoot," I said, lowering the rifle. "But I already called the sheriff. They'll be here in 5 minutes. So unless you want to spend the night in a cell, I suggest you sit down on that rock and think about who just ruined your future." They obeyed, silent and pale. When the deputy arrived, the kids were still sitting there. One was crying, the other looked numb. To the officer's credit, he was calm. "You boys are lucky. If this man hadn't had cameras, this could have gone very badly. I didn't press charges, but I did did a full report and made sure their names were noted. I don't want to ruin their lives," I told the deputy. "But they need to understand boundaries." As they were driven off, one of them turned and whispered, "Debbie said it was legal, that you were breaking the rules." That was the moment I realized just how deep Debbie's lies had gone. The next day, Ellie filed a formal complaint with the county HOA regulatory board. With the meeting minutes Jeremy had provided, plus the security footage of the teens and the fake cease and desist letter, we now had a compelling case for gross HOA misconduct and malicious intent from a sitting president. The HOA board members, especially those who had quietly supported Debbie, started to sweat. Within 72 hours, Debbie was suspended from her position pending an internal investigation. And that should have been the end. But it wasn't. Debbie didn't go quietly. She sent out a community-wide email with the subject line, "The truth about Carter Lake, what he's hiding." The email was filled with wild accusations, that I was polluting the water, that I had secretly sold rights to developers, and that the habitat declaration was forged. She even attached a fake before and after photo showing the lake with algae blooms and oil slicks, completely photoshopped. I laughed at first. Then I got another letter, this one from the County Environmental Board. They were requesting an emergency inspection of my lake based on an anonymous report of hazardous contamination. Until they completed the inspection, they were placing a temporary freeze on all activity, including boating. My own access, again, was being threatened. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. I stared at the notice, stunned. She actually did it, I muttered. She played the final card. Ellie was furious. This is harassment. Weaponized bureaucracy. But we had no choice. We had to comply. The inspection was scheduled for Friday morning. 2 county officers in green jackets arrived with clipboards, gloves, and test kits. They walked the banks, took water samples, and questioned me like I was a suspect in a crime. I didn't argue. I let them work. 3 hours later, one of the inspectors called me over with a puzzled look. He held a test strip and pointed at the results. "Sir, I don't see anything out of the ordinary. No elevated toxins, no chemical runoff, no oil. In fact, this water's cleaner than most lakes around here." I breathed a long sigh of relief. By noon, they handed me a clearance letter stating that Carter Lake was in excellent ecological condition. The hold was lifted, my boat access restored. But that wasn't the biggest news of the day. Later that afternoon, a black SUV pulled up outside the HOA clubhouse. A tall man in a suit stepped out, followed by 2 others carrying briefcases. It was the state HOA ombudsman's office. Turns out Ellie had reported Debbie's actions not only locally but at the state level. And they were there to do a surprise audit. An audit that would uncover Debbie had misused funds, doctored board votes, and used HOA resources to run her personal campaign of revenge against me. By sunset, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Debbie Jacobs was officially removed as HOA president. She was also being investigated for multiple counts of fraud, intimidation, and defamation. It felt like the war was finally over. But just as I was setting the phone down with a smile, Rusty started barking again. This time at something in the mailbox. I walked out slowly, opened the metal box, and found a single sheet of paper. No stamp, no envelope, just 5 words written in black marker, "You think this is over?" I stood there on the dirt road, staring at the paper in my hand, the ink still fresh, like it had just been written minutes ago. 5 words. That's all it said. "You think this is over?" I looked up and down the road. Nothing. No footprints, no car tracks, just Rusty growling low behind me, like he could smell the threat still hanging in the air. Whoever left it knew exactly what they were doing. No postage, no envelope, no signature. Just a message meant to rattle me. But I wasn't rattled. I was angry and tired and ready to bring this thing to an end once and for all. I scanned the security cameras and rewatched the last hour of footage. Just like I feared, someone wearing a hoodie had approached from the west fence line. They moved fast, head down, and reached into the mailbox without hesitation. No vehicle in sight, on foot. Who was still helping her? Debbie was officially gone from the HOA. Her public smear campaign had failed. Her environmental accusation backfired. Yet here we were, still playing a game that she refused to quit. I decided to play a little game of my own. The next day, I drove into town and visited an old friend, Mr. Calhoun, the owner of the local newspaper and a proud local who'd been publishing small-town stories for 40 years. I showed him everything, the photos, the letter, the fake contamination claim, even the vandalism reports. He whistled low and leaned back in his chair. "I tell you, Jake, this ain't just a story. This is a warning to every landowner in the state." "Exactly," I said. The article ran in Sunday's edition, "Rancher Battles HOA Tyranny, Fights Back with Law and Land." The story included verified facts, security footage stills, even a quote from the county ombudsman about Debbie's removal and investigation. It spread fast. By Monday, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Channel 9 wanted an interview. A property rights blog in Texas reposted the story. Local ranchers began calling to share their own HOA nightmares, cases of harassment, gate cutting, fine stacking, and lies. The tide was turning. But Debbie wasn't done. That same week, a drone flew over my ranch, low, buzzing just above the treetops. Rusty barked like mad, chasing it from one end of the property to the other. I grabbed my binoculars and tracked it until it hovered directly above the lake. Then it dropped something. A small black pouch hit the water and floated briefly before sinking. It was too far out to reach from shore, but I had a plan. I waited until the next morning, then took the boat out, Rusty at my side. I dropped anchor where I saw the pouch land and used a hooked pole to dredge the bottom. It took 20 minutes, but I eventually pulled something up. It was a weighted, waterproof bag. Inside, a flash drive and a note: "Let's see what happens when the world finds out what's really in your files." I raced back to shore and plugged the drive into an old laptop, not connected to the internet, just in case it had something malicious. What I found made my blood run cold. Photos? Dozens of them. They looked like satellite snapshots, thermal scans, and drone footage of my ranch. Labeled folders with titles like Underground Lines, Southern Ridge Survey, and Water Flow Risk Zones. One folder simply read, "Sell to developer." It hit me then. Debbie wasn't acting alone. There was someone else, maybe a group, working behind the scenes, and they wanted the land, not just for the lake or fishing or control. They wanted the entire ranch. And they were mapping it for sale without me. I made 3 calls immediately. First to Ellie, who cursed louder than I'd ever heard when I explained it. Second to Marcus, the conservation officer, who promised to have the state land department look into any unauthorized surveying. And third to Jeremy, the former HOA vice president who had turned whistleblower. He picked up on the second ring. "Jake, I was hoping you'd call. I just found something you need to see." We met that evening behind the local diner. Jeremy handed me a brown envelope full of printed emails, internal HOA correspondence. One stood out, from Debbie to a man named Robert Simmons, who turned out to be a developer from Knoxville. "I can make the lake inaccessible and force his hand. Once he breaks zoning or violates a code, we file an eminent domain request and hand it to your office. We get the ranch, you get the land, everyone wins except him." The timestamp? 3 months before she ever stepped on my dock. I sat back against the wall, stunned. They were setting me up from the beginning. Every fake violation, every fishing claim, the boat ban, even the environmental stunt. All of it had been part of a long game to steal my land. Ellie filed for a full cease and desist against the developer. The next morning, Marcus opened a state-level investigation into unauthorized land surveillance. But I knew it wouldn't stop them. Not completely. So I made one final decision. I wasn't going to defend my ranch anymore. I was going to fortify it. I hired 2 retired veterans, friends from my fire department days who now worked in private property security. Together, we installed new motion detectors, upgraded my cameras to full perimeter coverage, and brought in solar-powered floodlights. I reinforced the gates, put up new signs, and got legal approval to install trailblazing bollards on the old access routes. This was no longer just a ranch. It was a fortress. The next time someone tried sneaking in, they'd be seen. They'd be caught. And this time, I would press charges. Still, as the week ended and things started to quiet, I felt it deep in my gut. Debbie wasn't done. And the developer? He was just getting started. Because the following morning, I got a letter from the zoning board, and the headline said, "Proposed eminent domain evaluation, Carter Ranch Parcel 211B." I stared at the letter like it had crawled out of a nightmare. Proposed eminent domain evaluation? My hands tightened around the paper. It was real. They were really trying to take my land. The justification? Community benefit and environmental alignment with urban expansion plans. Urban expansion? This wasn't a city lot. This was a 200-acre ranch surrounded by forest, rolling fields, and wildlife. No power lines, no sewers, not even paved roads in some parts. What urban expansion were they talking about? But the worst part was the final paragraph. A public hearing will be held in 30 days to evaluate the viability of repurposing Carter Ranch land and water bodies for community recreational use and long-term housing development. They weren't just coming for my lake anymore. They were coming for everything. Ellie stormed into my ranch that afternoon like a lawyer out of a courtroom drama. She waved a copy of the notice in one hand and slammed her laptop on the table. "They're pulling strings at the zoning board," she said. "Someone's fast-tracking this, and I'll bet every dollar I've got that it's Robert Simmons, that developer Debbie was dealing with. But we've got protected status." "The lake's a habitat zone," I said. "They can't override that, right?" "They can try," she countered. "They're claiming the protections are based on false information and privately influenced reports. In other words, they're accusing you of faking everything." Rusty whined beside us. He could feel the tension. I looked Ellie in the eyes. "How do we fight this?" "We expose it," she said. "All of it." Over the next few weeks, Ellie went full war mode. She dug into zoning laws, property records, conflict of interest clauses, everything. We discovered that Simmons had donated to the election campaigns of 3 zoning board members. We found emails between HOA members and city planners hinting at a mutual development plan. And then, a gold mine. A former employee of Simmons's firm sent us leaked documents, internal memos, land acquisition maps, and a proposal to name the future subdivision Lakeview Heights. They had already drawn up blueprints. They planned to build 50 luxury homes on my land. I forwarded everything to a state investigator, and Ellie sent sealed copies to 2 newspapers and a federal land abuse watchdog. We knew the hearing was coming, and we were going to walk in with every receipt. But before we could do that, we needed to protect the land physically. I wasn't taking any more chances. I had concrete barriers delivered. We laid down heavy rock at the old North Trailhead to block vehicles. Rusty wore a GPS collar at all times now, just in case someone tried to poison or steal him. The neighbors started to notice. Some, especially the younger HOA crowd, still avoided me, believing whatever story Debbie had fed them. But others came forward quietly, respectfully. An older man named Hank brought me a pie and said, "You're doing the right thing, Jake. That land should stay in your family." A woman named Rachel, whose kid once fished in my lake, stopped by to apologize. "I didn't know what she was doing," she whispered. "I just wanted a place to take my son fishing. It reminded me why I'd allowed him access in the first place. I wanted to share the land, but not with people who would lie, manipulate, and steal. Not with people who'd try to bulldoze my life for a profit." The day of the zoning board hearing arrived on a windy Thursday morning. The room was packed. HOA members, lawyers, reporters, a few of my rancher neighbors, and even a handful of angry-looking developers in tailored suits. I wore jeans, boots, and my old firehouse jacket. Ellie walked beside me in a navy blazer with a folder under one arm. We looked like David and Goliath, but I was done being the underdog. The board sat stiffly behind their long desk. A man in the middle adjusted his glasses. "We're here to evaluate the community's proposal to reassess zoning classification of Carter Ranch for potential development under public benefit." Debbie wasn't in the room, but Robert Simmons was. He sat in the back row, arms crossed, smirking. The board asked me to speak first. I stepped up to the microphone, cleared my throat, and began. I told them about the land, how I inherited it from my grandfather, how I cared for it, preserved it, opened it freely to neighbors for years. Then I told them what happened, the harassment, the vandalism, the fake cease and desist, the drone, the sabotage, the teenagers, the lies. I presented the photos, the security footage, the habitat protection declaration, the articles, the signed letters from residents, from conservation officers, from environmental experts. Then Ellie took over. She passed out a thick binder to every board member, detailing the internal HOA corruption, the fake fishing claims, the donation trail, and the leaked development proposal. She dropped the final blow like a bomb. "This isn't about public good. It's about private profit. A developer using a disgraced HOA president to force a land grab. And if this board proceeds with this evaluation, you are legally complicit in land fraud." Silence. You could hear a pin drop. Even Simmons shifted in his seat. The board went into a closed session for an hour. When they returned, Their spokesperson announced, "The zoning review has been terminated. Carter Ranch will remain in its current classification. No further hearings will be held." The room erupted. Some gasped, others clapped. Simmons walked out before the statement even finished. Ellie grabbed my shoulder. "It's over, Jake." I exhaled, finally letting go of 3 months of tension. I got home that night and walked down to the lake with Rusty. The water was calm, the sky full of stars. I sat on the dock, letting the breeze roll over me. We'd won. But just as I was about to head back inside, I saw a shadow move by the trees. I stood up, flashlight in hand, but no one was there, just the wind and a strange, flickering light far off on the HOA trail, like a flame. The flicker of light danced in the dark, barely visible through the trees. I narrowed my eyes and stepped slowly off the dock, Rusty tied at my side. The flashlight beam cut through the night like a sword, but it couldn't reach that far. Another gust of wind. The light flickered again. Closer now. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the perimeter camera feeds. My stomach turned. Even the zoning board chair visited to shake my hand and thank me for standing up for rural landowners. Jeremy, the former HOA vice president, led a movement to dissolve the HOA entirely and rebuild a smaller, voluntary neighborhood association focused on respect, not rules. He asked if they could still use the lake one day, not as a right, but with permission. I said yes. On one condition, that kids learned how to care for the land as much as they enjoyed it. We held a cleanup weekend. Families came. They picked up trash, planted flowers, and even built new wooden benches near the edge of the lake. And I, Jake Carter, stood there quietly, finally at peace. I had won not just a legal battle, but the right to live free on my own land, by my own rules. The ranch was still mine. The lake was still mine. And the next time someone thought about threatening that, they'd think twice, because this time, the entire town stood behind me. And Debbie? She was last seen selling her house to a young couple who just happened to be environmental lawyers. Poetic, isn't it?